They say humiliation has a sound. For Amina Brooks, it was the laughter that followed her husband's words. Everyone, meet Sloane, the love of my life. The words floated across the glass atrium of the Art Institute of Chicago, smooth and cruel, dressed in applause. In that moment, under the amber lights and champagne chatter, Amina's entire world tilted. Not in rage, not in disbelief, but in recognition. She had just witnessed her own erasure, delivered with a smile. If you've ever been invisible in plain sight, if you've ever swallowed your pride to keep the peace, stay with me, because this story isn't about her heartbreak. It's about what she builds from it. And before we go further, take a breath, like, share, or follow if you've ever promised yourself, never again. Because this one's for every woman who's been told she should be grateful to be chosen. The night was supposed to be theirs. Chicago glittered outside, snow swirling like ash over Michigan Avenue. Inside, the Hale Foundation Gala was the event of the season. White linens, abstract sculptures, and money disguised as art. Amina stood near the marble staircase, the perfect wife of the perfect man. Her dress was a deep bronze that caught the light just so, the shade she'd chosen to honor her grandmother's skin. But here it only marked her as exotic. Jonathan Jack Hale, philanthropist, venture investor, art world darling, had that effortless kind of authority that made people lean in when he spoke. He was born to be seen, and he treated visibility like property. Amina used to think his confidence made her safe. Tonight, it felt like a weapon. The crowd hushed when he stepped to the microphone. He was announcing a new artist-in-residence program, he said, someone whose vision had redefined what beauty means in the modern city. Then he gestured to a slim white woman standing by the stage, Sloane Voss, and said the words that sliced through the room. The love of my life. There was a pause, one of those cinematic silences where even the violins seemed to hold their breath. Someone coughed. Then came the applause, polite, confused, relentless. Amina's body moved before her mind did. She set her champagne flute on the edge of the table and smiled, the kind of smile that cracked without sound. Her heart didn't break. Something quieter did. The illusion that she still belonged in her own story. She didn't make a scene. That would have been a gift to him. She simply turned, her heels whispering against the marble, and walked straight out into the cold. The doors of the museum closed behind her with a sigh. Outside, the city roared. Buses, wind, the low hum of the L tracks overhead. Amina breathed it all in like oxygen. For the first time in years, she wasn't Mrs. Hale of the Foundation. She was just Amina, daughter of Marla Brooks, urban planner from Bronzeville, who once drew city blocks on napkins and believed maps could be moral. The Lake Michigan wind slapped her cheeks, stung her eyes, but she didn't cry. Tears would have been too small a response. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, Jack's name lighting up, then again, then again. She turned it face down, then off. Across the street, a bus ad flickered. Build the city you deserve. It felt like a dare. She walked with no destination, just motion. Through the loop, past windows filled with reflections that didn't belong to her. Every step was an unlearning. How to walk without apology. How to breathe without permission. How to exist without being curated. Somewhere near the river, she stopped. Snowflakes landed on her skin and melted, leaving tiny bright scars of water. She whispered to herself, "This is not the end. This is the blueprint." That line, that vow, would be the first brick in everything that came next. Back inside the gala, someone asked Jack where his wife had gone. He smiled the same smile that had fooled donors and cameras alike. She wasn't feeling well, he said. The lie tasted easy on his tongue. He didn't know that outside, under a streetlight, Amina Brooks was feeling everything. And that was far more dangerous. Because stories don't begin where love ends. They begin the moment a woman stops asking to be seen. And Amina Brooks? She had just remembered her name. Chicago was still half asleep when Amina Brooks stepped off the overnight bus from downtown and into the wide, cracked sidewalks of Bronzeville. The early light poured down in streaks of gold between the gray stone buildings, touching the murals that bloomed across alley walls. Faces of poets, saints, and ghosts. This was where her story had begun, long before gala lights and glass towers, before she traded blueprints for ballroom smiles. The city did not welcome her with warmth. It met her with wind, that fierce, bone-deep Chicago wind that peeled away the weak parts of a person until only truth remained. And for Amina, truth was heavy. It lived in every street sign she'd once sketched in her notebooks. In every boarded window she dreamed of reopening. In every corner store her mother had promised would someday thrive again. Bronzeville had raised her the way storms raise trees, by forcing their roots deeper. Her mother, Amina Brooks, was a social worker who worked double shifts at Mercy Hospital, always smelling faintly of coffee and lavender soap. Marla was sharp-tongued, devout, and determined that her daughter would have a life larger than survival. She'd tell Amina, "Baby, you build what you can't find. Don't wait for permission to live in it." Those words had sounded poetic when Amina was 12. They became scripture by the time she was 32. That morning, she walked past her mother's old building on Langley Avenue, the bricks now painted a defiant yellow by whoever lived there next. The porch sagged, but the same iron railings still curled like vines. She remembered sitting there as a girl, sketching streets from imagination, tree-lined, clean, alive. Back then, she didn't know that maps could lie, that city planning was as political as prayer. Her fascination with space had begun here, in a neighborhood often defined by what it lacked: resources, attention, investment. Amina had drawn parks where empty lots stood, light rails where buses refused to come. She wanted to make the city kinder, to prove that architecture wasn't about power but people, but life, and Jack Hale had rewritten that dream into something polished and polite. Now, standing on those same sidewalks, Amina realized she had never really left. She had just been edited out. At a corner cafe she'd once loved, now run by a young couple selling sweet potato lattes, she sat with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, trying to locate herself. The local news on the mounted TV hummed about rising housing costs, new developments, and a renaissance in the South Side. She knew what that word meant: displacement dressed in optimism. Renaissance for some meant eviction for others. Her stomach twisted. She had once designed for people like these. Now she wanted to design with them. Across the table, a mural filled the far wall. A woman with a halo of sunflowers, eyes closed, face lifted to the wind. Beneath it, in faded script, "We are the city we build." Amina traced the words on her napkin, over and over, until they blurred into something new. An idea that wasn't quite a plan yet, but pulsed with potential. That's when she saw her reflection in the window. Not the polished, photogenic Mrs. Hale, but the woman underneath. Tired eyes, raw face, the faint streaks of mascara that told on her. Yet for the first time in years, she didn't look broken. She looked real. She pulled out her old sketchbook, the one she'd stuffed into her tote before leaving the penthouse. Pages yellowed with age, smudged with graphite, full of the dreams of a younger self. On one page, she'd drawn a community plaza, surrounded by trees and laughter. On another, a women's center with wide windows and a playground shaped like wings. She stared at it, a lump rising in her throat. The sketches weren't just drawings. They were blueprints for the life she'd wanted before she was taught to want less. That afternoon, she walked the neighborhood again, down King Drive, past the church where choirs practiced on Thursdays, past the library still waiting for renovation funding, past murals faded but still defiant. Every corner whispered a memory: her first bicycle crash, her first crush, the block party where her mother had danced until her shoes broke. At 35th and Giles, she paused before a vacant lot fenced in by rust and neglect. Weeds swayed like small rebellions. There was nothing remarkable about it, except that she remembered the playground that used to stand there, before budget cuts and storms tore it down. Children used to call it the ship. They'd climb its wooden decks and shout that they were sailing to better worlds. Amina stood there for a long time. The city hummed around her, trains rattling overhead, dogs barking, sirens fading in the distance. For the first time since the gala, she smiled, faint but real. Maybe the city that had once failed her could still be the city that saved her, if she learned to rebuild it differently. When the sun dropped low and turned the windows bronze, She took a photo of the lot. Her phone screen reflected her face, half in light, half in shadow. Bronzeville bones, she murmured, not as nostalgia, but as a vow. That night, back in the small studio apartment she'd rented for the month, she pinned the printed photo to the wall above her desk. Beneath it, she wrote 3 words in thick black ink. Build from here. The city that had shaped her, wounded her, and nearly forgotten her was calling again. And this time, Amina Brooks wasn't going to ask for permission to answer. The first time Amina met Jonathan Hale, Chicago's skyline was on fire. Not with flames, but with light, gold spilling down the mirrored faces of the towers as the sun sank behind the river. It was one of those evenings when the city pretended to be gentle. The rooftop terrace of the Hale Foundation shimmered with money, ambition, and chilled white wine. Amina had been invited as a guest speaker, a young urban planner from the city's community development office, asked to present on equitable housing initiatives. She arrived in a thrifted navy dress and heels borrowed from her best friend Noelle, thinking she would simply speak, leave, and disappear. But fate has a sense of theater. Jack noticed her before she reached the podium. He was surrounded by the kind of people who never seemed to blink: venture donors, museum directors, men with loosened ties and women with practiced smiles. He was laughing, holding court as the city lights began to bloom below them. But when Amina began to speak, his gaze shifted, not polite, not passing, but fixed. Her voice, low and measured, carried over the clinking of glasses. She spoke of forgotten neighborhoods, of red lines that still bled, of sidewalks that ended too soon. She spoke not in policy, but in poetry, about how a city could betray its people and still beg to be loved. The crowd nodded, half listening. Jack didn't. He was riveted. Afterward, he found her by the glass railing, where the wind tangled her curls and the river below caught the last streaks of daylight. "You make zoning sound like gospel," he said, smiling the kind of smile that came with consequences. Amina laughed. "That's because it should be. Cities are confessions, Mr. Hale. They show you what we really value." "Then let me confess," he replied. "I value what I just heard." It was bold, almost cinematic. She rolled her eyes, but the compliment stuck like static in her chest. No one in her professional world spoke to her that way. Not with admiration, not without agenda. She didn't know yet that Jack's flattery was its own kind of architecture, designed to impress, engineered to last just long enough. He asked for coffee. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became late-night walks along the river, where his stories painted him as both savior and survivor. The self-made boy from Ohio who built empires out of spreadsheets and charm. He spoke of legacy, of art, of meaning, of how he'd left Wall Street to fund what truly mattered. And Amina, still young enough to believe sincerity could sound rehearsed, let herself be seen, or what she thought was seen. Jack had a talent for reflection. He mirrored back whatever a person wanted to believe about themselves. When Amina spoke about city renewal, he called her a visionary. When she confessed she sometimes felt invisible in the rooms she fought to improve, he said, "Then you need bigger rooms." He offered her a key to those rooms: invitations, introductions, admiration. He made her feel like the city she loved might finally open its gates. He didn't rush her. He didn't need to. Jack understood tempo, how affection, like investment, required patience to feel inevitable. He sent flowers that weren't roses, dinners that weren't extravagant but intentional. Once he surprised her with an old copy of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, annotated with his own notes. The gesture disarmed her. How could she distrust someone who cared about the same things? 6 months later, they stood together on that same rooftop where they had met, the skyline reflected in the glass panels around them. Jack held a small velvet box, not flashy, but heavy. "You said cities are confessions," he told her, voice almost tender. "Then marry me, and let's build one together." Amina's breath caught. The wind rose, whipping her scarf into the air. Below them, the river lights flickered like applause. For a moment, she saw not a proposal, but a promise. Partnership, purpose, permanence. She didn't see the cage being built from compliments. They married that autumn in a private ceremony at the Museum of Contemporary Art. The vows were brief, elegant, photographed for the society pages. The press described them as Chicago's most visionary couple, the builder and the believer. In the beginning, he was generous with admiration. He'd listen to her talk about equitable zoning or child-friendly public spaces, then say, "That's brilliant, Mina. I'll fund it." When his foundation backed a youth design initiative she dreamed up, she thought it meant faith. In truth, it meant ownership. Slowly, subtly, his praise began to change shape. "Do you really need to go to that community meeting yourself? My team can handle it. Let me talk to the board. They listen better to me. Your ideas deserve more polish. I can help with that." Each comment small enough to ignore, each one rearranging the structure of her confidence. At dinners, she'd catch him watching her not with affection, but evaluation, as if calculating how she fit into the image he was curating. And she told herself it was just stress, just pressure, just love turned practical. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, when something in her recoiled, like the night he gave her a diamond bracelet and said, "You don't need to work so hard anymore. You've already made it." She'd smiled, thanked him, and gone to the bathroom where she stared at the mirror until her reflection blurred. Because making it, she realized, meant being still while he kept building. From the outside, they looked perfect. Two architects of influence shaping the city together. From the inside, she was becoming an exhibit, framed, polished, labeled success story. The girl from Bronzeville who'd been upgraded into elegance. And yet, every time she stood in their penthouse, a fortress of glass and silence, she could feel the ground below humming with the city she'd left behind. She didn't know it yet, but the cracks in that glass tower had already begun to spread. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruelty of it, the way erasure disguises itself as care. Amina didn't wake up one morning and realize she'd been reduced. It was a slow edit, invisible in real time, like a photograph quietly losing color. The first cuts were small. A dinner she didn't have the energy to attend. A committee meeting Jack said he'd cover for her. He framed each suggestion as protection. "You're overworking yourself, Mina. Let me handle this one." She told herself it was partnership, not control. The language of love can be treacherous that way. It borrows tenderness to disguise theft. At first, the changes felt like rest. She stopped going to late-night design sessions at City Hall, stopped pushing for zoning reform meetings that always ended in the same excuses. She told herself she was conserving energy for bigger things, but the bigger things never came. What replaced them were fittings, luncheons, photo ops. Jack would beam at her during interviews and say, "Amina's vision inspires me every day." She'd smile, nod, and feel herself flatten. Her ideas, once messy, radical, alive, were now being translated into his sound bites, his press releases. She had become a beautiful echo. The penthouse they moved into was a masterpiece of restraint. All glass, marble, and echoing silence. From the 43rd floor, she could see the city's arteries glowing beneath her. Neighborhoods she used to work in reduced to specks of light. The home looked like success. It felt like captivity. There was a shelf by the window where her old sketchbooks sat, untouched. Once, she reached for one. Out of nostalgia, maybe rebellion, and Jack's voice drifted from across the room. "You really should take a break from that. You've earned the luxury to relax." Earned the luxury. The phrase sat between them like a verdict. When her mother, Marla, came to visit, she looked around the apartment with an expression that was half awe, half warning. "Baby, this place is pretty," she said, "but it don't look like it breathes." Amina laughed it off. But that night, lying beside Jack in the wide, cold bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that her mother had seen something she hadn't. Jack's charm remained, just evolved. It was quieter now, confident enough not to ask for gratitude. He'd kiss her forehead before business trips, leave her jewelry boxes with little notes. "To the woman who makes everything possible." He never said what, exactly, she was making possible. When she mentioned missing her work, he smiled without looking up from his laptop. "We've already done that chapter. Why relive struggle when you can curate success?" Curate. Another word that dressed control and sophistication. Soon, invitations arrived addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Hale. Never Amina Brooks Hale, never Miss Brooks. She told herself it didn't matter. But one evening, while flipping through a magazine feature on Chicago's most influential power couples, she found her photo captioned simply, Jonathan Hale and wife. No name, just wife. She stared at it until the letters blurred. It wasn't rage that filled her, not yet, but a kind of quiet disbelief. How efficiently she had been edited out of her own life. At charity events, people would smile at her and say, "You're so lucky. Lucky to have Jack. Lucky to live here. Lucky to be adored." She learned to return their smiles with precision, gracious, contained. She learned that being palatable was its own kind of performance. The world applauded her composure, mistaking silence for grace. The woman she used to be, the one who argued with aldermen and dreamed up green corridors for Bronzeville, was shrinking, frame by frame. When she tried to remember the sound of her own voice at those meetings, she couldn't. Her solitude became ritual. Mornings spent staring out at the skyline, afternoons filled with yoga classes she didn't enjoy, evenings rehearsing smiles for photographs. Sometimes she'd wander the apartment barefoot, whispering to herself just to hear language exist. And then came the day she tried to sketch again. She opened her old book to a blank page, pencil trembling in her hand. But her mind, once full of angles and skylines, was fog. Every line she drew felt wrong, foreign. She pressed harder, desperate, until the pencil snapped. The sound startled her, small, final. She stared at the broken graphite and realized it wasn't just the pencil that had fractured. It was her. That night, as Jack hosted investors in the living room, she sat in the dark of their bedroom, listening to laughter spill through the walls. His laughter. Her absence didn't matter. The party went on. She looked at her reflection in the window, the city lights floating through her image, and understood finally that she had become transparent. Not unseen, but decorative, visible only as proof of his success. The thought didn't make her angry. Not yet. It made her sad in the deepest, most quiet way, the kind of sadness that hums like electricity behind your ribs. She thought of Bronzeville, of cracked sidewalks and murals that refused to fade. She thought of her mother's voice, "You build what you can't find." Amina realized she hadn't built anything in years. She'd been built, shaped, styled, softened, until she fit neatly into someone else's architecture. And when she looked down at the glittering grid of Chicago beneath her, she saw it clearly for the first time. Every shining tower built on stories like hers. Women whose brilliance had been dimmed to make the skyline prettier. The city looked beautiful that night. But beauty, Amina now knew, could be a form of disappearance. It began, as most revolutions do, with a silence so deep it felt like surrender. The gala at the Waldorf Tower was nearly over. The lights were soft, the champagne endless, the air thick with flattery and the scent of polished success. Amina stood near the edge of the ballroom, the train of her silver gown pooled at her feet, smiling at a conversation she wasn't part of. Her smile had become muscle memory, gracious, symmetrical, forgettable. Jack was at the center of the crowd, a constellation of admirers orbiting his confidence. He looked untouchable under the chandelier's gold spill, one hand tucked in his tuxedo pocket, the other resting lightly on Sloane Voss's bare back, as he guided her toward a cluster of investors. The gesture was practiced, intimate, almost imperceptible, but Amina saw it. Of course she saw it. She didn't flinch, not when he introduced Sloane as a creative partner who's changed my life. Not when laughter followed, not even when she caught the sympathetic glance of a socialite who knew exactly what that meant. Amina just stood there, still and composed, while something inside her quietly rewrote its own rules. Later, in the car, the silence between them was colder than the night air. Chicago glittered outside, the lake a sheet of black glass. Jack scrolled through his phone as if she weren't there. "You were quiet tonight," he said finally. "I didn't have much to say." He gave a faint smile without looking up. "That's new." That was the last sentence she heard from him before she decided to stop being small. By the time the car reached the penthouse, her mind was no longer fog. It was blueprint, precise, deliberate. She walked through the glass doors, unzipped the gown, and left it in a soft silver heap on the floor. In its place, she put on jeans and a long wool coat. No jewelry, no performance. Just skin, breath, and resolve. She moved through the apartment like a thief reclaiming what was hers. The old sketchbook from the drawer, a few folded clothes, her grandmother's ring, and the photo of her mother on the porch of their Bronzeville home. The essentials of self. When she reached the elevator, Jack's voice called from the living room. "Mina, where are you going? It's almost midnight." She didn't turn around. "Home," she said. He laughed, confused. "You are home." She pressed the button for the lobby. "Not anymore." The elevator doors closed before he could answer. Outside, Michigan Avenue was almost empty. The streets glistened from a passing rain, reflecting the city's endless lights, each one sharp, alive, unbothered by her leaving. The wind came off the lake, slicing through her coat. She pulled it tighter, walking without destination, without fear. Cars hissed by. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophone wailed from an open bar door, low and mournful. The sound reminded her of her mother's voice, of Sunday mornings filled with gospel radio and the smell of cornbread. For the first time in years, she let herself miss that version of her life, the one untouched by wealth or permission. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The vibration came again, and again, relentless. She turned it off and slipped it into her bag. The night was too sacred for interruptions. When she reached the river bridge, she stopped and looked down. The city mirrored itself in the dark water, towers like vertical ghosts. Somewhere below, her reflection trembled in the ripples. For a heartbeat, she saw the woman she had become. Polished, muted, almost erased. Then she blinked, and that version vanished. She whispered into the wind, "Enough." The word was small, but it carried. It sounded like freedom in its first language. A rideshare car slowed as it approached. She climbed in, gave the driver an address she hadn't said aloud in years. Noelle Carter's apartment in Bronzeville, and leaned her head against the cool window. As the city slid by, her pulse steadied for the first time in months. From the back seat, Chicago looked different. Not like a cage of steel and ambition, but like a living thing, breathing through the alleys and bridges. She saw herself reflected faintly in the glass, and behind her, the skylines shimmered like a myth she no longer believed in. Noelle's voice message still lived somewhere in her memory. "You ever get tired of pretending? You come home. No judgment, just couch space and wine." Tonight, that memory felt like a hand extended through the dark. The car turned south, trading glass towers for brick walls, wide streets, corner stores still open late. When it stopped, she hesitated for a moment before stepping out. The night air was thick with the smell of rain and fried food, the sound of laughter drifting from a nearby apartment window. It was imperfect. It was alive. Noelle opened the door before Amina could knock. Her friend's eyes widened, not in surprise, but in understanding. Without a word, she pulled Amina inside, wrapped her in an oversized sweatshirt that smelled like detergent and home. For a long while, neither spoke. They just sat on the couch, city lights filtering through the blinds. When Amina finally did speak, her voice was steady, stripped of performance. "I left," she said simply. Noelle nodded, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "Good. About time." The words landed like grace. Later, after Noelle had fallen asleep and the apartment had gone quiet, Amina stood by the window, watching the rain beat against the glass. From here, the skyline was a distant shimmer, beautiful but irrelevant. She thought about the woman still standing in that penthouse, silent, ornamental, smiling for cameras. And then she realized that woman no longer existed. Amina Brooks had left her on Michigan Avenue at midnight, a ghost in heels, swallowed by the wind. What remained was someone raw and unfinished, pulsing with the terrifying, electric truth of beginning again. Outside, the city exhaled, as if it had been holding its breath for her. Morning in Bronzeville arrived like a verdict and a pardon. Light slanted through Noelle's blinds, striping the second-hand couch where Amina had slept in a tangle of sweatshirt and borrowed quilt. The apartment smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. A radio murmured somewhere, low enough to be kind. Amina lay very still, listening to the soft clatter of Noelle in the kitchen, and felt the strangest sensation, safety so sudden it hurt. "Up!" Noelle called. "The city's already lying. We need to tell the truth before lunch." Amina sat up, hair wild, mascara a faint bruise. "What truth?" The one you almost forgot to live, Noelle said, setting down 2 mugs and a spiral notebook. She wore a robe printed with oranges and an expression that had rescued Amina since 8th grade. We're making rules. The you that left Michigan Avenue, we're keeping her. They ate toast at the coffee table like teenagers, crumbs everywhere, knees touching. Noelle flipped open the notebook and clicked a pen. Rule 1. No heroic silence. We name what happened. Amina stared at the lined paper. Words came, halting at first, then in a rush. He introduced her as the love of his life. I was there. I left. Writing it made her heart thud, not with shame but with the clean ache of accuracy. Rule 2, Noelle continued. We stabilize. Credit cards, accounts, passwords. He will turn money into a leash. I grabbed the essentials, Amina said, then faltered. He can freeze everything else. Then we make our own heat. Noelle's smile was flinty. I called someone. Tamika Cole. Family law, mean as gospel. Noon. Amina blinked. Noelle, you always had the plan for the city. Let me have the plan for you. The knock came exactly at 12, brisk and uncompromising. Tamika Cole entered like a storm in perfect heels, square glasses, a leather folio, the air of a woman who'd buried a dozen men in deposition and gone to Pilates after. She shook Amina's hand once and sat without ceremony. I read the public filings, Tamika said. I know who he is. My question is, who are you? It was not a philosophical inquiry. Amina forced her voice to be whole. I'm an urban planner. I designed programs the foundation funded, brokered relationships, hosted donors, wrote talking points he delivered. I gave up my position because he asked. Tamika's pen worked like a metronome. So you ran unpaid strategy, hospitality, and reputation management. That's economic partnership. We can quantify it. She looked up. And the incident? Amina swallowed. At his gala, he introduced someone else as the love of his life. A silence followed, reverent as a church. Tamika nodded once. Humiliation as exit wound. Juries understand that language. She slid a paper forward. We file today. He'll freeze accounts. We'll unfreeze. He'll call you unstable. We'll produce calendars, emails, receipts. Meanwhile, you do 3 things. Document, don't negotiate alone, and don't go back. Don't go back. The words struck like iron cooling in water. After Tamika left, Noelle stretched like a cat that had witnessed justice. Rule 3, she said, tapping the notebook. You create daily. Pencil to paper. Doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to be yours. Amina reached for her old sketchbook with the reverence of touching a forehead to a doorframe. She opened to a blank page. The fear returned, familiar, clinging, but Noelle scooted closer until their shoulders met. Your hand remembers, she whispered. Trust your bones. The line that flowed was thin and nervous, then steadier, then sure. A floor plan blooming into rooms with wide windows. A courtyard where the light could sit down and rest. A childcare room adjacent to a legal clinic. A kitchen that smelled like dignity. She didn't name the building, not yet, but she wrote 2 notes in the margin. Lockers for safety and Northlight for courage. When she finished, her throat was tight, her palms inky. See, Noelle said, your voice has geometry. By late afternoon, the phone began its campaign. Jack first, calls that stacked without message. Then a text that read, let's be adults. Then another, come home and we'll discuss. She turned the screen face down and slid it beneath the couch cushion like a live wire. He will escalate, Noelle said, not unkindly. Rule 4, all communication goes through Tamika. We protect your peace like it's oxygen. They spent the evening building small fences against panic. Noelle made a folder in the cloud and labeled it Spine. They dragged in screenshots, event photos, drafts Amina had written for Jack's speeches, donor thank you emails addressed to Amina and Jonathan that had been published as Jonathan's vision. Each document was a brick. The pile became a wall. When hunger arrived, they cooked in companionable silence. Garlic, tomatoes, a handful of basil from a mason jar on the sill. As the sauce simmered, Amina leaned against the counter and let the day's edges soften. "What if I'm not built for war?" she asked. "You're not," Noel said. "That's why we don't declare one. We declare clarity. He can fight. You'll build." They ate at the window, the neighborhood turning rose outside. Somewhere down the block, a kid practiced trumpet. 3 wrong notes, 1 brave one. Amina closed her eyes and felt the music knock softly at the ribs. "Rule 5, Noel said, lifting her glass. "No pretending small. Not in this house." Amina laughed. "Unexpected. Easy. Deal." Night laid its quiet across the apartment. Noel's couch remembered the shape of a decade's worth of emergencies. It took Amina's weight without complaint. She scrolled through her camera roll, past the trophies of the curated life, until she reached the fresh photo she'd taken of a vacant lot that morning, a rectangle of possibility. She pinned it to the top of an album she named Begin. Another message lit the lock screen, a publicist from the foundation asking for alignment on narrative. The old Amina would have crafted a careful reply. The new one powered the phone off and set it on the sill. Before sleep found her, she wrote her own last rule on a sticky note and pressed it to the notebook's cover. "I am not the apology for his choices." Outside Bronzeville breathed, sirens far off, a couple arguing, a dog's bark, the hush of a bus exhaling at a stop. Inside the apartment held a different weather, the calm that follows the first honest decision. On the coffee table, the sketch dried in the stale evening air, lines steadying into intent. Later, much later, Amina would look back and name this room what it was. Not a refuge from the war, but the lab where a different world was designed. Noel's couch wasn't soft, the springs testified to that, but it held the first night of a life rebuilt on rules that fit. And when the cold crept under the drafty window, Amina pulled the quilt to her chin and smiled. A private thing. Some houses keep you safe by locking the doors. This one kept her safe by unlocking her voice. It was enough for now. Tomorrow could be brutal. Tonight, the city's lullaby was simple and exact. You are home because you said so. The morning the papers were filed, Chicago woke up gray and sharp-edged. The air tasted like iron, the kind that signals storms or change. Amina stood by the window of Noel's apartment, clutching a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the city grind awake. Somewhere downtown, a man who had once called her indispensable would soon learn that she had learned how to disappear and to document. Tamika Cole arrived at 9 on the dot, coat immaculate, eyes alert. She dropped her leather briefcase on the table like a declaration of war. "We're in motion," she said. "He'll get served this afternoon. By tonight, he'll be on every call with every lawyer who owes him a favor. Don't panic when he postures. That's just theater. You're building the record." Paper was power, Tamika said. Proof turned into precedent. She spread files across Noel's dining table. Financials, correspondence, tax documents Amina had quietly saved before leaving. "He built his empire on visibility," Tamika continued. "Ours will be built on receipts." Amina's hands trembled as she signed the first affidavit. "This doesn't feel real," she murmured. "It's not supposed to," Tamika replied. "It's supposed to feel necessary." That afternoon the calls began, first from Jack, then from his assistant, then from a number marked unknown. Noel answered the first one on speaker, voice calm as glass. "She won't be taking calls. Any communication can go through counsel." Jack's tone was measured, performative civility over panic. "This is unnecessary. We're adults, Noel. You're making this harder than it has to be." "She's not making anything," Noel said. "You did that yourself." Then she hung up. By evening, Jack's PR machine had found its rhythm. Friends texted her screenshots, whispers on social media, thinly veiled blind items in lifestyle columns about a philanthropist's wife battling emotional instability. It was an old tactic, and an effective one. She sat on Noel's couch, scrolling through the digital smoke, feeling both violated and strangely detached. He was writing his version of her in public. She was rewriting herself in private. When Tamika came by the next morning, she brought pastries and a folder labeled Strategy. "He's moving fast," she said. "We move smarter. First, we freeze his narrative, I want a personal statement, not for the press, for the file. Your voice, your version. It matters more than you think." Amina hesitated, then began to write. Her words were spare but sharp. "I was asked to step out of my profession in exchange for stability. That exchange was never equal. I was visible when it benefited him, invisible when it didn't. I'm reclaiming both my labor and my name." Tamika read it, nodded once. That's power. It took 3 weeks for Jack's mask to crack. He showed up at Noelle's building one night, pounding on the buzzer, shouting her name into the intercom. "We can fix this, Mina. Don't ruin both of us." His voice was thin with disbelief, like someone realizing too late that the ground beneath them had been borrowed. Noelle pressed the police emergency key without hesitation. The squad car's lights splashed blue against the brick walls. From the window, Amina watched Jack's face in the wash of color. Anger, then confusion, then something like fear. When the officers escorted him away, he turned once, searching for her silhouette. She didn't flinch. He had mistaken her quiet for weakness too many times. Afterward, her knees went weak. Noelle caught her, guided her to the couch. "You okay?" Amina nodded. "I think that was the first time I didn't explain myself." "That's what freedom sounds like," Noelle said. But freedom was work. Every day became a rhythm of rebuilding. Meetings with Tamika, gathering proof, relearning the language of worth. Some nights, exhaustion settled in her bones like winter. But there was also clarity, cold, steady, undeniable. One afternoon, while reviewing financial records, Tamika discovered something useful. Amina's name buried in the foundation's project notes, attached to initiatives Jack had claimed credit for. "He underestimated you," Tamika said, grinning. "This right here, this is leverage. You didn't just stand beside him. You built pillars under his name. We can prove that." That night, Amina walked to the park near the apartment, her phone buzzing with more missed calls, more stories rewritten in her absence. She let it all ring out. Above her, the city lights shimmered like a field of stars trapped in glass. She remembered something her mother had told her once, years ago. "The world will always try to make you small, baby. Your job is to grow anyway." She whispered it into the cold air, not as comfort, but as command. When she returned, she found Noelle asleep at the table, the rules notebook still open. Amina added one more line beneath the others. Rule 6. Let the truth be louder than the rumor. Weeks later, the first court date arrived. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, the air-conditioned chill making her fingertips ache. Jack sat across the aisle, immaculate as ever, surrounded by lawyers who looked like confidence made flesh. He didn't look at her, but she could feel the weight of his disbelief pressing across the room. When the judge entered, Amina felt her pulse slow. This wasn't the ballroom. This wasn't a conversation she could lose by being quiet. Here, silence had been replaced by evidence. Her sketches, her documents, her words, her proof. Tamika leaned close and whispered, "Welcome to the first day of the rest of your story." Amina smiled, small, steady, steel-edged. Paper, power, precedent. This time, all three belonged to her. It started with a pencil. After weeks of paperwork and witness statements, Amina's life had begun to sound like a deposition. Dates, figures, exhibits. But one afternoon, when the noise became unbearable, she reached for her sketchbook. It was the same one she'd carried through college, its pages yellowed, corners curled, edges faintly smelling of graphite and hope. She hadn't touched it in years. When she flipped to a blank page, her fingers shook. Not from fear, but from the weight of returning. At first, the pencil felt foreign in her hand, like a language she used to speak fluently but had forgotten. Her first line wobbled, hesitant. The second was cleaner. The third curved into something deliberate. And then, there it was, the quiet click between mind and motion, memory and imagination. The page began to breathe. She drew until her wrist ached. Facades, arches, rooms full of light. The shapes came from memory. Her grandmother's porch, a south-facing classroom in Bronzeville, the rhythm of row houses pressed together like hymns. These were not monuments to ego or wealth. They were spaces for healing, for shelter, for beginnings. When Noelle returned from work and saw her hunched over the table, she smiled softly. "There she is," she said. Amina looked up, startled. Who? The woman who builds air. The next morning, she decided to take a step she'd been avoiding. She enrolled in a continuing education program at the University of Illinois at Chicago, a re-entry course for architects and designers returning after career gaps. It was 12 weeks of drafting, modeling, and the kind of relentless critique she hadn't faced since her 20s. On her first day, she felt like an imposter. Everyone else seemed younger, faster, untouched by collapse. She sat in the back, clutching her pencil like armor. But then Professor Lila Santiago, a woman with silver braids and a voice like command, entered the room. Architecture, Santiago began, isn't about building things. It's about building purpose. If you're here because you want applause, you'll starve. If you're here because you want to serve, you'll survive. The words hit Amina like scripture. By week 3, her hands had remembered the discipline of precision, the crisp satisfaction of line weights, the heartbeat in the hum of the plotter, the meditative rhythm of measurement and mistake. Her first project, a redesign of an abandoned library, received a quiet nod from Professor Santiago. "You design like someone who's had to rebuild herself," she said. "That's a gift. Don't waste it trying to impress anyone." Outside class, Amina spent long hours in the campus studio, headphones in, pencil whispering across tracing paper. She'd leave close to midnight, walking home through the city streets, feeling the pulse of Chicago beneath her feet, the hum of buses, the echo of footsteps, the steady proof of survival. Each night she returned to Noelle's apartment smelling of ink, exhaustion, and something close to peace. Meanwhile, Jack's world was unraveling in small, satisfying increments. Tamika's legal strategy was methodical. Each motion filed, each claim countered, each lie dismantled by evidence. But Amina refused to center him anymore. His downfall was no longer her victory. Her focus had shifted. She wasn't fighting him. She was fighting to remember who she was before him. One Friday, Professor Santiago stopped her after critique. "You're ready," she said. "There's a design competition opening next month, the Haven Project. National submission. They're looking for architectural concepts that merge function with empathy. I think you should apply." Amina blinked. "I'm not ready for that kind of spotlight." Santiago smiled. "You've already been in the spotlight. The difference is, this time it'll be for your work, not your silence." That night, Amina spread papers across Noelle's kitchen table, sketching until dawn. Her concept grew from a single image, a building that could breathe. Not metaphorically, literally. Walls that filtered light, courtyards that gathered air like lungs, a place where women rebuilding their lives could live without apology. She called it Harbor House. The name came from something her mother once told her. Even storms need somewhere to rest. Every inch of the design was personal. The central courtyard mirrored the empty lot in Bronzeville she'd stared at weeks earlier. The playroom windows were angled so the morning sun would fall on the children's faces first. The community kitchen opened onto a garden where women could grow what they ate. It wasn't architecture. It was autobiography in blueprint form. When she presented the concept to Professor Santiago, her hands trembled. Santiago studied the renderings in silence, tracing the edges with a fingertip. Then she looked up and said, "You've designed more than a building. You've designed forgiveness." The feedback session that followed was brutal. Adjustments to proportions, accessibility details, ventilation. But none of it scared her. Each correction felt like collaboration, not critique. For the first time in years, Amina felt the pulse of creation, uncorrupted by performance. She submitted the project just before the deadline. Weeks passed. She tried to forget about it, burying herself in coursework and Tamika's trial updates. But on a Wednesday morning in February, her email pinged. The subject line read, "Congratulations, you've been selected as a finalist." Her first instinct was disbelief. Then laughter, sharp and breathless, filled the small apartment. Noelle came running from the shower, towel in hand. "What? Did we win the lottery?" "Better," Amina said, tears catching in her smile. "I remembered how to build." That evening, she stood at the window, looking out at the city lights, their reflections trembling in the glass. The skyline had once looked like a fortress keeping her out. Now it looked like a canvas waiting for her to draw again. She traced her finger against the cold pane. outlining invisible walls and windows, the shape of a dream no longer deferred. The world outside hadn't changed, but she had, from exhibit to architect, from ghost to groundbreaker. And somewhere deep inside, under the hum of neon and traffic, she felt it, her craft, her calling, her breath returning to her hands. The first time the new studio lights flickered on, the space looked almost defiant. Bare brick walls, concrete floors, a ceiling webbed with pipes. Imperfect, echoing, alive. The sublease had cost her nearly every dollar left after legal fees. But when Amina stepped into that old warehouse in Pilsen, she knew it was the right kind of ruin, the kind you rebuild from. There were no marble floors, no glass walls this time, just sunlight pouring through tall windows, and the ghost of paint from murals long painted over. It smelled like dust, like wood, like freedom. Noelle had helped her drag in the first table, a scuffed drafting desk rescued from a school auction. They placed it in the center of the room like an altar. On it sat Amina's sketchbook, her mechanical pencil, and a small stack of tracing paper. The space was empty, but it pulsed with potential. "This is it," Noelle said, hands on hips, surveying the emptiness. Amina smiled faintly. "It's nothing." "No," Noelle corrected. "It's yours." In the beginning, there was mostly failure. Her first week in the studio, Amina stared at her designs for Harbor House and felt nothing but doubt. Every idea seemed too fragile to survive contact with reality. Funding proposals bounced back unanswered. The city's zoning board returned her inquiries with bureaucratic silence. A potential sponsor wrote, "We admire your vision, but it doesn't align with our current priorities." For every yes, there were 20 polite no's. But failure, she realized, wasn't an ending. It was a draft. She began to iterate. Every rejection turned into a revision. Every obstacle became a problem to solve, not an omen. She printed the latest zoning denial, circled the clause in red, and rewrote her proposal to address it point by point. She called community leaders, architects, nonprofits. Some ignored her, some listened. A few believed. It was during one of those late nights, coffee cooling beside her, that she met May Lin. May was an investor known for funding projects others called unscalable, a woman with quick eyes and no patience for empty vision. She walked into the studio wearing a trench coat and skepticism. "You've got 10 minutes, she said. Amina nodded. "Then I'll only take 9. She unrolled the Harbor House plans across the table. Lines and lights spilled together. The garden courtyards, the shared kitchens, the shelter rooms with private entrances. "It's not charity," she said. "It's infrastructure for dignity." May studied the drawings, tapping a finger on the page. "You're mixing architecture with activism. That's risky." Amina met her gaze. "So is pretending people don't need both." The silence stretched, charged. Then May smiled, small but real. "Send me your budget breakdown," she said, and left. 2 weeks later, the first investment arrived. Modest but enough to breathe. Enough to move forward. From that moment, the studio transformed from solitude into motion. Mornings began with meetings. Volunteers, students, small contractors who believed in her vision. Afternoons were filled with noise. Printers humming, pencils snapping, voices arguing about airflow and form. The walls that once echoed with emptiness now carried laughter, frustration, the sharp rhythm of work. There were setbacks, always. A contractor quit mid-project. A shipment of materials vanished in transit. The roof leaked every time it rained. Some nights, Amina sat on the cold floor, head in her hands, whispering, "What am I doing?" But then she'd look at the drawings pinned across the wall, dozens of iterations of Harbor House, and remember, failure was iteration. Iteration was progress. Professor Santiago visited one afternoon, her silver braids tied back, her eyes sweeping the room. "You've built a studio, not a shrine," she said approvingly. "Good. Architecture should be noisy." Amina laughed. "It's also broke, then it's honest." One evening, as she worked late alone, she noticed something strange in the fading light. The way her pencil's shadow danced across the tracing paper, thin and alive. The studio felt like it was breathing again, her breath, her heartbeat in the walls. It reminded her of the way she used to draw as a child, when buildings were just hope with straight edges. Word of her project began to spread. Journalists started calling, curious about the architect rebuilding Chicago from the inside out. Women from across the city came by the studio. Social workers, artists, mothers, bringing stories, sketches, sometimes just silence. Amina began keeping a large corkboard labeled, "What We Need to Build," pinning their ideas beside her own. She learned that designing for people meant designing with them. One afternoon, a group of neighborhood elders visited to review her plans. They sat around the drafting table like a council of wisdom, sipping coffee and debating window placement. One woman, Mrs. Green, pointed at the blueprint and said, "You see this courtyard? It's too perfect. Real life is messier. You need corners for people to linger." Amina adjusted the layout the next morning. She added benches, shade trees, a mosaic walkway, spaces for pauses, for small talk, for breathing. It became a metaphor for her own life, learning to leave corners where she once demanded perfection. By spring, the studio had become a community unto itself. Noelle started spending evenings there, writing articles about women reclaiming their professions. May dropped by to review financials and stay for dinner. Even Tamika visited once, bringing news that Jack's legal team had offered another lowball settlement. "He's trying to test your endurance," Tamika said. Amina smiled, wiping graphite from her fingers. "He doesn't know how long I've been building foundations." On the anniversary of the day she'd left Michigan Avenue, the first prototype for Harbor House was complete. A detailed 3D model glowing under the studio lights. When she turned off the lamps, the miniature building gleamed faintly in the dark, its windows glowing like heartbeats. She stood in the silence, staring at it. This wasn't the perfection she'd once chased. It was something rarer, proof of persistence, proof that collapse could become architecture. The studio was still rough, still leaky, still loud. But when she looked around at the messy tables, the walls layered with failed drafts, the voices of people who refused to quit, she felt something sacred. Creation, she realized, was not about control. It was about permission to start over, to fail again, to build until the walls could finally breathe. The morning she was due in court, the city felt unnervingly still. Chicago had that rare kind of quiet that precedes both storms and revelations. The air heavy, the sky low, the streets too calm. Amina woke before sunrise, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. Today, her words would matter again, but not as defense, as declaration. She dressed simply, navy suit, no jewelry, hair tied back. No armor, no distraction, just truth. Noelle hugged her at the door, murmuring, "Don't perform. Just tell the story like you built it." In the courtroom, fluorescent lights hummed, indifferent. The scent of polished wood and paper filled the air. Across the aisle, Jack sat with 3 attorneys, all confidence and cologne, flipping through notes that turned her marriage into evidence. He looked immaculate, but thinner somehow. Not physically, but in essence, like a painting left too long in the sun. Tamika leaned toward Amina. "You'll go up after recess," she whispered. "We start with the numbers, end with the narrative." Amina nodded, her pulse calm, rhythmic. For months, she'd practiced speaking her truth without apology. This was just another version of that. Different audience, same architecture. By the time she took the stand, the room had grown colder. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a patient voice, asked her to state her name. "Amina Brooks. And your relationship to Mr. Hale," she paused. "Former wife, former partner in every sense but title." Tamika began the questioning with precision. "Ms. Brooks, can you describe your contributions to Mr. Hale's business during your marriage?" Amina drew a breath, grounding herself. "I managed investor events. I wrote speeches he delivered. I designed proposals for community projects under his foundation's name. I met with donors, advised on public image, reviewed architectural drafts. I worked, unpaid, for 7 years to maintain the illusion of his empire." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jack shifted, jaw tightening. Tamika continued, voice steady as a metronome. "Were these contributions ever acknowledged financially or professionally?" "No," Amina said simply. "I was told that visibility was its own reward." Her gaze flicked to Jack then. just briefly. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, something like recognition flickered there. Not regret, not apology, just awareness. The first time he seemed to truly see her, not as extension, but as opposition. When the defense rose to cross-examine, their tone was practiced condescension. "Ms. Brooks," one of the attorneys began, "isn't it true that you voluntarily left your position to support your husband's career?" "Yes," she said, "but I didn't realize I was resigning from my own life." A few people in the gallery gasped softly. Even the judge's pen hesitated mid-note. The attorney's smile tightened. "And now you're pursuing financial compensation?" "I'm pursuing acknowledgement," Amina replied. "Money fades, records last." Tamika couldn't have scripted it better. By the end of her testimony, the courtroom had turned from adversarial to attentive. Her words, though measured, carried a quiet authority, the kind that doesn't ask to be believed because it already knows it's true. When she stepped down from the witness stand, Tamika squeezed her hand and whispered, "That wasn't a defense. That was an education." But Amina wasn't finished speaking that day. She had another podium waiting. That same evening, in a lecture hall 2 states away, her voice filled a very different room. The Haven Project had invited her to present as a finalist in their national competition. Amina had debated postponing, the court schedule, the fatigue, but Professor Santiago had insisted. You can't build justice in one room and stay silent in another. They're connected. So she flew to New York, traded the courtroom's chill for the warm hum of a university auditorium, and stood under lights that felt almost too bright. On stage, she faced an audience of architects, journalists, and students. Her hands still bore faint ink stains from the deposition papers she'd signed that morning. Behind her, a projection of Harbor House filled the screen. Sunlight, greenery, lines drawn for breathing. She began, not with blueprints, but with confession. "When I stopped designing buildings, I started designing excuses," she said. "I convinced myself that silence was stability, that invisibility was peace. It took losing everything I'd built for someone else to remember what I wanted to build for myself." She gestured to the plans glowing behind her. "This project isn't about architecture. It's about recovery. It's for women starting over, who need walls that hold them without owning them. It's for communities told they're temporary, when they've been the foundation all along." The crowd leaned in, the kind of silence charged with emotion, not apathy. She described the building's breathing walls, the communal garden, the private rooms designed with dignity, not pity. "A house can't heal a person," she said, "but it can stop hurting them." Halfway through, she saw something that startled her. People wiping tears, nodding, taking notes. It wasn't applause she was after. It was resonance, and she had it. When she ended, the room erupted. Not loud, but sustained. The kind of applause that feels like a standing heartbeat. Later, a young woman approached her, clutching a notebook. "I didn't know architecture could sound like that," she said. Amina smiled. "Neither did I, until I remembered who I was drawing for." That night, back in her hotel room, Amina sat by the window, watching the city she didn't live in flicker and hum. Her phone buzzed. A message from Tamika. "You were magnificent in both rooms today. 2 podiums, 2 audiences, 1 truth. Rebuilding wasn't revenge, it was reclamation." Somewhere below, a siren wailed, and she thought about all the women who'd ever had to testify for their own existence. In courts, in classrooms, in boardrooms, in their own homes. She thought about how each of them, in their own way, was building something too. And as she set her sketchbook on the windowsill, Amina realized that both of her podiums, the wooden one where she swore to tell the truth and the bright one where she spoke it, were foundations of the same architecture. One built justice, the other built meaning. Together they built her. It didn't end in flames. It ended in spreadsheets. For a man like Jack Hale, ruin didn't come with scandal or spectacle. It came quietly, in margins and decimals. A ledger that refused to lie. A board meeting that turned into a eulogy for confidence. The same numbers he once wielded like proof of genius began to betray him, line by line, until there was nowhere left to hide. It began the week after Amina's testimony. The market turned, the foundation's investments wobbled, and a developer he'd guaranteed personally went under. He called it temporary turbulence, in interviews, smiling through the cracks. But numbers don't blink. They simply count down. Amina didn't follow the headlines at first. She had learned not to feed on his gravity. Still, news traveled. A friend forwarded an article. Hale Foundation faces audit over mismanaged funds. She read it once, expressionless, then closed her laptop. It wasn't triumph she felt, only inevitability. Jack's world had always been built on borrowed belief. Investors' trust, donors' applause, her silence. When any one of those wavered, the structure trembled. Now all three were gone. Meanwhile, Amina's days filled with new motion. The Haven Project had announced Harbor House as one of its winning designs, securing national coverage and a modest grant for construction. The studio buzzed with volunteers, press, and the hum of new beginnings. She should have been elated, but the pace left little space for joy. Progress had a cost: exhaustion, vulnerability, exposure. One evening, Maylin arrived with 2 coffees and a grim smile. "You're about to get calls from reporters," she warned. "They're tying his name to yours in the coverage. The fallen mogul and his ex-wife, the rising architect. They love symmetry." Amina exhaled slowly. "Of course they do. You want me to issue a statement?" "No," she said. "Let silence be the story." It's the one he never understood. But silence doesn't mean absence. Inside her, something complicated stirred. Not pity, not satisfaction, but recognition. She had lived inside that same illusion once, believing control could be confused with security, that success could substitute for self. Watching him lose everything felt like watching her past disintegrate under fluorescent light. Across town, Jack sat in his office long after midnight, staring at balance sheets that had turned to confession. Every failed investment, every exaggerated expense, every whisper of misconduct, all reflected back at him. The walls of glass he once loved now made him visible from every angle. He had spent a lifetime performing prosperity. Now, the audience had left. In the months that followed, the empire folded in increments. 1 board member resigned, then 2. The auditor's report leaked. Contracts evaporated. By autumn, the Hale Foundation was a hollow shell, still standing, but empty. Amina heard through Tamika that he'd sold the penthouse. "Below market value," Tamika said with a wry shrug. "It's poetic." But poetry was never Amina's goal. Closure was. In the studio, progress was chaos disguised as creation. Walls filled with renderings, schedules, and sticky notes. The air carried the scent of sawdust and ambition. Amina worked 12-hour days, building what she'd once only imagined. But even success can ache when it comes after survival. She caught herself, some nights, thinking about the man she'd once shared a skyline with. She didn't miss him. She missed the idea she'd built around him. The idea that love, properly arranged, could be symmetrical. Now she knew. Symmetry was a myth. Real architecture was about tension, balance, resistance. So was healing. One afternoon, Professor Santiago visited again. She walked slowly around the model of Harbor House, running her fingers along its edges. "You've learned the hardest lesson," she said. Amina looked up from her desk. "Which one?" "That collapse isn't failure," Santiago said. "It's instruction." A week later, an unfamiliar number appeared on Amina's phone. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. It was Jack's assistant, or the woman who used to be. Her voice was cautious. "Miss Brooks? I thought you should know. He's closing everything down. He asked me to forward a message. He said, 'Tell her I understand now.'" Amina's throat tightened, but her voice was calm. "And what did you say?" "I told him it was too late to understand." Amina smiled faintly. "You were right." When she hung up, the city outside seemed quieter than usual. The wind off the lake rattled the studio windows, carrying that unmistakable Chicago song, the sound of resilience, of things that bend but don't break. She walked over to the wall where all her blueprints hung in layers. Early sketches, revisions, corrected errors. The newest version of Harbor House glowed under the lamplight. Every change told a story, lessons learned, mistakes repurposed. It struck her suddenly that she had lived her own design philosophy without realizing it. Buildings fail for the same reasons people do. Foundations cracked by neglect, structures overburdened by ego. The trick isn't to avoid collapse, It's to build, knowing the earth will shift beneath you, and to design for flexibility, not perfection. Jack had built for permanence. She was building for breath. Weeks later, she stood on site at the empty lot that would become Harbor House. Construction hadn't begun yet. The ground was uneven, marked with flags and stakes. She pressed her boot into the soil and felt the softness give way. "This is where it starts," she whispered. The wind answered by carrying the sound of laughter from a nearby park. Children shouting, mothers calling them back. A city alive with noise and motion. It wasn't the polished quiet of the life she'd left. It was the honest, unscripted sound of continuity. She closed her eyes and pictured him one last time, not as villain or ghost, but as a chapter already written. In her mind, she said what she'd never said aloud. "You taught me how to build without believing in the walls." When she opened her eyes, the skyline stretched before her, dusk painting it bronze and blue. She had thought power came from standing at the top. Now she understood it came from standing firm when everything above you fell. The Hale Foundation would vanish from the headlines soon enough. But Harbor House, born from silence, built on resilience, would stand. Because numbers might not blink, but people can. And when they finally open their eyes, they start again. By spring, the case had narrowed to numbers. The lawyers called it a settlement phase, but Amina knew it was something more human. The moment when truth meets valuation. When worth becomes a column on a spreadsheet. Jack's team offered $1.8 million in one property, a condo overlooking the river, glass-walled and empty. The proposal came wrapped in civility, in phrases like mutually beneficial conclusion and allowing both parties to move forward. It was the kind of settlement meant to feel like peace. Tamika slid the papers across the table and waited. "You know what this is, right?" Amina scanned the lines, the signatures waiting like traps. "An exit, an erasure," Tamika corrected. "They're betting you want closure more than justice." Amina leaned back, her eyes steady. "They're right about one thing. I do want closure, but not his kind." Tamika smiled, the small, approving smile of someone watching steel form. "Then let's talk value." The next morning, the studio smelled like coffee and sawdust. Maylin was already there, reviewing grant spreadsheets. "You look like someone who didn't sleep," she said without looking up. "Tamika says we go to trial," Amina said. "He's offering to buy me out of my own story." May pushed her glasses up. "And you?" "I don't sell legacy for convenience." "Good," May said, "because Harbor House is going to need every ounce of fight you've got left." The funding process had entered its most fragile stage. Applications pending, investors waiting, deadlines crowding closer. Each number was both lifeline and liability. One missed email could collapse the entire project. Some days, it felt like her old life again, except now she was the one holding the blueprint and the risk. A journalist had recently described her as an architect of redemption. The phrase unsettled her. She wasn't redeemed, she was rebuilding. Redemption implied something was wrong with her to begin with. All she'd done was decide she deserved to exist on her own terms. Still, that description followed her everywhere. On panels, in press, in quiet admiration disguised as pity. And every time, she wondered how many women had been praised for surviving instead of being protected in the first place. One evening, as rain drummed against the studio windows, Tamika arrived unannounced, trenchcoat glistening. "We got a counteroffer," she said, dropping a folder on the table. $4.3 million, full rights to the condo, and a non-disparagement clause. Amina stared at the paper, expression unreadable. "It's generous," Tamika said carefully, "but it means you can't speak about any of it again." Not the manipulation, not the humiliation. It buys your silence. Amina traced the clause with her fingertip, the ink blurring under the lamplight. "Price versus value," she murmured. Tamika tilted her head. "Meaning? Price is what they pay to make you disappear. Value is what you keep when you refuse." Tamika exhaled slowly. "Then you already know your answer." But knowing and deciding are different muscles. That night, after Tamika left, Amina walked alone through the rain-slicked streets of Pilsen, the city glowing in fractured reflections. She passed murals she'd helped design in her early career, color splashed against brick, defiant, unpolished. They reminded her that creation was never convenient. She paused outside a small bakery still open past midnight. Through the window, a woman kneaded dough with steady rhythm, flour dusting her hair like snowfall. The scene was ordinary, sacred. Labor without audience. Work for the sake of sustenance. Amina stood there until her reflection in the glass felt less like a stranger. She realized then that what she wanted wasn't to win. It was to build a life that didn't require performance to feel real. When she returned to the studio, she wrote a single line in her notebook. I choose the hard yes, the kind that costs, but creates. The next morning, she met Tamika and May at a downtown cafe to confirm. I'm rejecting the settlement, she said simply. We go to trial. Tamika's grin was wolfish. Then let's bury him with precision. May raised her coffee cup in salute. And let's make sure your work outlives the noise. Over the next few weeks, the world outside seemed to move faster. The court date loomed. The Harbor House proposal advanced to its final funding review. Amina balanced depositions and design meetings like parallel worlds. Some nights, she fell asleep at her drafting table, her dreams full of courtrooms turning into blueprints and walls growing from testimony. On one of those nights, Professor Santiago called. You sound exhausted, she said. I am. Good. It means you're learning the real architecture of change. It's never clean lines and symmetry, Amina. It's endurance, iteration, and grace under gravity. Grace under gravity, Amina repeated softly, smiling. That's the hardest structure to build. When the trial opened, the gallery was full. Journalists, students, strangers, people who had followed her story without permission. She tried to block them out and focused on the rhythm of truth. Tamika spoke like a conductor, orchestrating fact and empathy with exact precision. Across the aisle, Jack sat stone-faced. His empire was gone, but his pride was intact, or at least performing. During closing arguments, Tamika's words cut through the air like blue steel. This isn't about wealth redistribution. It's about the invisible labor that builds legacy and the arrogance that believes it can go unrecorded. We're not asking for more than fairness. We're asking the law to recognize value where society only sees price. Amina didn't look at the jury. She didn't need to. The air in the courtroom shifted. That subtle tremor when silence becomes agreement. Outside, after the session ended, rain began again, steady and unbothered. Amina stood under the courthouse awning, letting the sound fill the space around her. Tamika joined her, umbrella in hand. You okay? Yes, Amina said, because for the first time, I didn't take the easy out. Tamika smiled. The hard yes always costs more. Amina watched the water pool on the pavement, reflecting the courthouse lights like fractured stars. Maybe that's why it's worth something. Later that night, back in her studio, she pinned a photo of Harbor House to the wall beside her earlier sketches. The original draft looked fragile now, too cautious, too polite. She began redrawing the roofline, making it bolder, freer, less symmetrical. Each line was a decision, each stroke a declaration. She would not be bought, contained, or quieted. By the time the sun began to rise, she stepped back and studied her work. The new design wasn't perfect, but it was hers, honest, flawed, alive. And in that quiet dawn, surrounded by paper and promise, Amina understood that value is never determined by what someone offers. It's defined by what you refuse to sell. The courtroom was quieter than church. Even the air seemed to hesitate, as if the city itself was waiting to hear the verdict. Amina sat perfectly still, hands clasped in her lap. The sound of papers shuffling from the judge's bench echoed like thunder in miniature. Beside her, Tamika was unreadable. The kind of calm that only comes from knowing you've already said everything worth saying. Across the aisle, Jack stared straight ahead. The arrogance that once framed his posture had collapsed into something smaller. Resignation, maybe, or the dawning comprehension that he no longer controlled the narrative. The judge's voice broke the stillness. In the matter of Brooks versus Hale, the court finds in favor of the petitioner. A pause, a heartbeat, and then full recognition of economic partnership with restitution as outlined by the court. Additionally, the court acknowledges Ms. Brooks's direct contributions to multiple initiatives under the Hale Foundation, and orders their public record to be amended accordingly. It was a legal victory, yes, but for Amina, it felt more like a reclamation of existence. Her name, once erased from credits and contracts, was finally written where it belonged, in ink, in history, in truth. She didn't smile. She just breathed. The judge continued reading the formalities, but Amina wasn't really hearing words anymore. She was hearing the sound of her mother's voice from years ago. The world will try to make you smaller. Don't help it. Now she hadn't. Tamika leaned over, whispering, "That's precedent, sweetheart. You just changed the law for someone else." Outside the courthouse, cameras waited like vultures dressed as angels. Rain had just stopped, leaving the marble steps slick and gleaming. Reporters shouted her name, microphones thrust forward. Amina blinked under the sudden light. "Miss Brooks, how does it feel to win? What do you want to say to women watching this right now?" She hesitated. 1,000 possible answers flashed through her mind. Polished, diplomatic, forgettable. But then she remembered the line she'd once written on a sticky note above her drafting table. "I am not the apology for his choices." She looked straight at the cameras and said, "You are not the footnote in his legend. Write the headline." For a beat, silence. Then the air fractured into noise, flashes, voices, a rising tide of reaction. But her words hung there, alive and sharp, cutting through the chaos. Someone recorded the moment on their phone. The clip went online within an hour. By evening, it was everywhere. On TikTok, her calm defiance was soundtracked by piano music and slow zooms. On Instagram, the quote appeared over photos of city skylines and unmade beds, shared by women who whispered, "Yes, this." On Twitter, it was fuel, threads of outrage, admiration, solidarity. A woman in a blue suit says what we've all wanted to scream. Amina Brooks didn't win just for herself. She won for everyone who's ever been erased with a smile. It wasn't fame she'd found. It was resonance. By midnight, the clip had reached 1 million views. By morning, 10. Her email filled with messages, journalists requesting interviews, advocacy groups offering partnerships, strangers sending thanks. One read simply, "Your sentence became my spine." Noelle sent a screenshot of the trending hashtag, #, write the headline, with a voice note that said, "You just started a movement, girl." Amina listened, then laughed softly. "No," she murmured, "I just stopped being quiet." Still, the sudden attention felt disorienting. She'd spent so long building quietly, brick by brick. Now the world was peering through the scaffolding, but there was no turning away from it. The story had escaped her control, as stories always do when they touch something universal. The next day, Maylin arrived at the studio holding her phone. "You realize your speech just doubled our fundraising potential." Amina groaned. "That wasn't a strategy." May smirked. "The best strategies never are. Authenticity performs better than PR." Professor Santiago sent a single text. "Architects design structures. Today you design language." By the end of the week, Harbor House had raised enough to break ground. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her former husband's empire had collapsed under vanity, while her own had risen on sincerity. When the press requested comment on Jack's response, she said only, "We both built things. One of them survived." In private, though, she thought about him, not as a villain, but as a mirror. He had been the lesson she'd needed, that everything built on erasure eventually erodes. The studio became a blur of motion after that, contractors, designs, community meetings. And yet, in rare moments of stillness, she'd glance at her phone and see fragments of herself reflected in the digital tide. Young women quoting her words, artists painting murals of her silhouette, essays titled, "The Architecture of Self-Respect." It was surreal, seeing her story become symbol. But it wasn't vanity she felt, it was a kind of gravity, a reminder that healing, when spoken aloud, gives permission. One evening after everyone had left the studio, she stood alone under the soft light of her desk lamp. On the wall were pinned drafts of Harbor House. Every failed version, every revision, every breakthrough, Together they looked like a timeline of evolution. Next to them, she pinned a printout of a tweet that read, "You are not the footnote in his legend." For a long time she just stared at it, not with pride, but with quiet disbelief that her pain had become someone else's permission slip. Then, almost unconsciously, she whispered, "If that's what it took, then maybe it was worth it." A week later, during a community planning session, a teenage girl approached her shyly. She wore a hoodie that read, #write the headline. "I watched your clip," the girl said. "Now I want to study architecture. I want to build places that don't forget people." Amina smiled. "Then promise me one thing." "What?" "Never let anyone design you out of your own story." The girl nodded, eyes bright. As Amina watched her walk away, she realized the real verdict had never belonged to the court. It belonged to moments like this, small, quiet victories unfolding beyond the reach of cameras. Justice had been decided by a judge, yes. But legacy? That was being written every day by strangers who had seen a woman refuse to disappear. And that was the kind of permanence no settlement could buy. The ground broke under a sky the color of forgiveness. There were no brass bands or ribbon-cutting ceremonies that morning, just the steady hum of construction machines and the smell of damp earth. Amina stood on site, boots sinking into the mud, hard hat slightly crooked. Around her, a small crowd of volunteers, contractors, and community members watched as the first foundation trenches were carved into the soil. This was it, Harbor House, no longer a dream on tracing paper. It was becoming real, one brick, one breath at a time. Noelle stood nearby with a camera, documenting every step. "You look terrified," she teased. Amina smiled, though her eyes were damp. "I am. Terrified and grateful. That's how you know it matters." The first shovel of clay hit the air, damp and red. For a moment, it reminded her of childhood, of afternoons helping her mother replant a backyard garden that never quite grew. Marla Brooks had always said, "Clay remembers every hand that's ever touched it." Standing there now, Amina realized this earth would remember her too. Construction was chaos disguised as choreography. Weeks bled into months of inspections, deliveries, weather delays. The blueprints she drafted with such precision met the unpredictable language of reality. Pipes, permits, personalities. But unlike the old days, she didn't hide behind control. She learned to adapt, to listen. The project's second phase expanded. Housing, yes, but also art studios, therapy spaces, and classrooms. And then, the idea for something even larger began to form. Commons and Clay, a community hub connected to Harbor House, a place for people to gather, create, and earn. Amina envisioned workshops, a ceramics cooperative, a courtyard market where local artisans could sell their work. "It's about regeneration," she explained to Mei Lin one night over takeout. "Not just rebuilding lives, but redistributing beauty." Mei smiled. "You're making policy out of poetry again." "Maybe poetry is policy," Amina said, half joking. "It's just the kind people actually remember." The studio became a whirlwind of blueprints and coffee cups. Volunteers came and went, architecture students, mothers from the neighborhood, a retired mason named Henry who taught her how to lay bricks that could outlive neglect. Every day was an equation of failure and improvisation. When the city balked at zoning variances, Amina showed up at the hearing with 20 women from the community and a petition signed by 2,000 residents. When a supplier tried to raise prices mid-contract, May calmly reminded them that public goodwill is a currency too. There were setbacks, always, but there was also momentum, a pulse she could feel in her bones. One afternoon, while reviewing site progress, Amina watched a group of children peering through the chain-link fence. Their laughter spilled into the air, untamed. She walked over, crouched, and said, "You'll be playing here soon." "What should we add?" A little girl in a purple jacket thought for a moment. "A big tree. For shade and secrets." Amina laughed. "A tree for secrets. Got it." She went back to the plans that evening and added it. A broad oak in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by benches and soft soil. A place to gather, or grieve, or grow. The kind of detail no grant application could quantify, but every heart would recognize. As the walls rose, so did attention. Journalists returned, drawn by the arc of her story. the woman who'd turned public humiliation into public good. A feature in Architectural Digest called her a designer of dignity. A social media video showing Amina walking the site with children went viral overnight. But for every compliment, she reminded herself, this wasn't hers alone. The signatures, the sweat, the small miracles, they belonged to everyone who had believed before belief looked rational. When Professor Santiago visited during the framing phase, she stood in the middle of the unfinished hall and closed her eyes. You built silence into the walls, she said softly. Amina frowned. Is that bad? It's beautiful, Santiago replied. Most architects forget to leave space for quiet. As summer waned, the first building reached completion. Workers scrubbed the windows until they gleamed, sunlight pooling across the concrete floors. The smell of fresh paint mingled with the faint sweetness of clay from the ceramics workshop. The opening wasn't glamorous, just folding chairs, lemonade, and music from a local jazz trio. Residents of the neighborhood wandered in, touching the walls, laughing, crying. Children ran through the hallways like wind. Amina stood near the entrance, watching it all unfold. She'd worn a white shirt and jeans. Nothing about her looked like the woman from the courtroom videos, now immortalized online. This version of her was softer, sturdier, clay after the fire. Noelle nudged her. You realize people are calling this the miracle on 35th Street. Nothing miraculous about it, Amina said. It's just work that was finally allowed to breathe. At one point, an older woman approached her, Mrs. Green, the neighborhood elder who'd once told her to add corners for people to linger. She took Amina's hand. You listened, she said simply. Most of them don't. Amina's voice wavered. I had to. The city raised me. This is me returning the favor. Mrs. Green smiled. Then let's hope the city learns how to return yours. That evening, as the crowd thinned and the sun slipped behind the rooftops, Amina stayed behind alone. The courtyard glowed with string lights, soft and amber. The new oak tree stood young but sure, its roots barely begun their journey downward. She placed her palm against its trunk and whispered, grow slow, grow deep. Behind her, the building lights flickered on, one by one, warm, golden rectangles against the indigo dusk. Each window, she thought, was a story waiting to be lived. A woman finding her feet again, a child dreaming of something bigger, a space for secrets and laughter and ordinary, everyday salvation. For years, she'd chased validation, money, praise, approval. Now she understood something purer. Creation was its own applause. She picked up a handful of clay from a nearby planter, rolling it between her palms. The earth that had once felt heavy with memory now felt like promise. When she looked up, the skylines shimmered in the distance, that same cold geometry that had once made her feel small. But tonight, it looked softer, almost human, as if even the towers were bending to listen. She smiled. From render to ground, she whispered. We made it real. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by light, clay, and laughter still echoing from the courtyard, Amina Brooks finally understood the architecture of belonging. Not a design drawn in lines and ratios, but in hands and hearts and hope. Dawn arrived like a whispered truce. The horizon over Lake Michigan thinned from graphite to silver, and the water took the color of a blade being honed. Amina stood at Promontory Point with her coat pulled tight and the city small behind her, the wind lifting her curls as if to say, look up. The oak in the Commons courtyard would be waking now, dew stitching itself along its baby leaves. Harbor House would be stretching, lights flicking on, coffee rising like an anthem from the shared kitchen. Somewhere, a child would be learning the shape of safety by counting steps from bed to window. And here, at the edge of the lake, Amina waited to do something she'd been postponing for months, set the last stone in the foundation of her new life. Footsteps on limestone. She didn't turn until the footsteps stopped. Then she faced the man she had once married, the man whose empire had dissolved without spectacle, the man whose silence had taught her how to speak. Jack looked older, not by years but by recognition. No entourage, no polished lines, just two people in the lake. I'm not here to argue, he said first, voice careful, or to bargain. I know, Amina replied. You don't have anything I want. He nodded, a flicker of humor that softened into humility. I deserve that. He took a breath. I came to say what I never managed to say when it would have mattered most. I was cruel in ways I called care. I made rooms where only my voice echoed and told you they were ours. I am sorry. Not for the verdict, for the theft. The waves stitched themselves against the stone. A stray gull carved the air with a sound like chalk on slate. Amina's heartbeat stayed steady. She thought of the cracked map in her wallet, the line she once drew from Bronzeville to the loop like a vein. Of Noel and Tamika and May, of Professor Santiago's stern kindness, of Mrs. Green requesting corners for lingering, of the girl in the hoodie promising to study architecture. The chorus of women who had carried her across the years of erasure. They were the city's true scaffolding. I forgive you, Amina said, and watched the words fall cleanly between them. But forgiveness is not a hinge. Nothing opens because I said it. It just means I won't carry you anymore. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the lake light cut through the last of his certainty. I know you're not coming back. I didn't bring a door. A long, quiet smile touched her face then. Soft, unafraid. It didn't gloat. It didn't grieve. It simply acknowledged a truth already shaped. He nodded once, as if agreeing to a boundary that had always existed. Then he turned and began the long walk along the water, shrinking to a dark stitch against the pale morning. Amina stood until the wind found its rhythm again. She reached into her pocket for the ring she'd kept, not the diamond from that glass tower life, but her grandmother's thin band of worn gold. She slipped it onto her index finger, where it caught the lake's first true gleam, and said aloud, "Inheritance, not ornament." The word tasted like bread. Her phone chimed. 3 messages. A photo from Noel of the courtyard at dawn, chairs still scattered from last night's community film. A voice note from May. Investor round closed. We're funded through phase 2. Also, sleep. And a text from Professor Santiago. New semester's studio brief. Architecture as continuum. Want to co-teach? She laughed, the sound surprising and sure. Co-teach, not as symbol, but as surgeon of space. Not the exhibit, but the practice. On the walk back, she cut through the point's low grass and photographed her shadow slanting long across the limestone. Years ago, that image would have broken her heart, the body that had become a silhouette in someone else's story. Now it meant possession. This shadow is mine because this light is mine. She sent the photo to Noel with 2 words, lake light. By mid-morning, she was at the studio, sun gathering like a blessing across the scuffed floors. Workers laughed, a drill whirred, the coffee machine hissed. On the wall, her earliest Harbor House sketch hung beside the latest construction schedule, every revision still visible beneath the final lines. She traced the palimpsest with her palm. This was what survival looked like, honest and layered, not erasing what hurt, but building over it with purpose strong enough to bear weight. A knock. A teenage girl from the neighborhood, the one with the "Write the Headline" hoodie, stood in the doorway clutching a portfolio. You said to bring my drawings, she said, suddenly shy. They're not, good. But they're mine. Amina stepped aside to let her in. We can work with mine, she said. We can make good together. They spread the pages across the drafting table, buildings with too many windows, streets with too much sky. Dreams that hadn't learned to apologize yet. Amina felt her chest rise with a clean, swelling joy. If legacy had a smell, it would be graphite and coffee and clay. If it had a sound, it would be 2 pencils starting at once. Near noon, Amina slipped out to the Commons courtyard. The oak held its new green like a promise it intended to keep. A woman from Harbor House rolled a cart of warm bread onto the path, and the yeasty heat spread in a wave that made strangers exhale as one. A boy practiced dance steps in the shade. Someone watered marigolds, a city's 1,000 small redemptions. Amina closed her eyes and let the moment register, not as spectacle, but as proof. Forgiveness without return, closure without collapse. A life that didn't audition for worth. When she opened them, she remembered a sentence that had once raced ahead of her into the world. You are not the footnote in his legend. Write the headline. Here was the addendum she hadn't said yet. And then live the paragraph. Fill it with names who are not you alone. She walked back inside and wrote a new rule on the whiteboard above the work table. Make the future hospitable. It looked plain in dry erase, almost modest, but she knew how steel could hide in small words. At dusk, the lake burned copper. She paused at the studio door before turning the deadbolt, savoring the ordinary holiness of locking up what you love. Tomorrow would bring new demands, fresh resistance, another round of numbers that didn't blink. She would meet them, not as a myth, not as a cautionary tale, but as a working architect of breath. On the way home, she texted her mother a photo of the courtyard under string lights. Marla replied with a verse Amina knew by heart. Joy comes in the morning. Amina typed back. It came with a blueprint. And for those listening now, standing in your own half-light, if this story put language to your ache, let it also hand you a tool. Share it with the one who needs permission. Leave a note with your headline. Follow along as we build the next rooms together, because somewhere a woman is waiting on a sidewalk with wind in her teeth and the truth in her mouth. When she hears your voice, she'll take the first step, and the city will change its shape around her.